If you're going to keep staring at me like that, Jason, you should probably tell me why. Ethan's voice came out softer than he intended, but the silence in the room made every word feel louder anyway. Jason stood near the window with one hand in his pocket, his expression unreadable, yet there was something different in the way his eyes kept returning to Ethan's face, as if he were trying to place a memory that refused to settle into focus. The afternoon light spilled across the apartment, warm and quiet, touching the edge of the kitchen counter, the folded blanket on the couch, and the small set of baby items Ethan had tucked away before anyone else could notice. He had spent years learning how to make a life feel ordinary enough to protect it, how to smile when he felt nervous, how to breathe through the moments when the past came too close. But Jason's presence had a way of making the room feel smaller, like the air itself had become aware of him. "You said your name was Ethan," Jason said at last, his tone low and careful. "That's what you told me." Ethan kept his face still, even as his pulse jumped. "It is my name." Jason's gaze dropped, briefly, to Ethan's hands, then to the corner of the room where the baby things were hidden in plain sight. It was only a glance, but it felt like a touch. Ethan shifted his weight, suddenly aware of every detail he had tried so hard to keep invisible. Jason looked back up. "Then why does it feel like I've heard your voice before?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He wanted to say no, to keep the line clean, to protect the fragile piece he had built with his own two hands. But something in Jason's face had changed. Not suspicion exactly, but a deep, unsettling uncertainty, the kind that came before truth. Ethan swallowed hard. "Maybe you're confusing me with someone else." It was a safe answer. It was also the wrong one. Jason's jaw tightened slightly, and for a second he looked less like a man in control and more like someone standing at the edge of a memory he had lost long ago. He took one slow step closer, then stopped, as if he sensed he had already crossed a boundary neither of them could easily name. The quiet between them stretched, full of all the things Ethan could not afford to say. Then, from the back room, came a small sound, a soft, sleepy little voice calling for him. Ethan's whole body went still. Jason heard it too. His eyes moved toward the sound, then back to Ethan with a flicker of surprise that Ethan had not been ready for. "Was that?" Jason began, but Ethan was already moving. "Stay here," Ethan said, too quickly, and the words sounded like fear. Jason didn't move, but his expression changed again, this time into something gentler, more guarded, as if he had just realized there was a door in front of him and it had been hiding an entire life. Ethan walked toward the bedroom, his mind racing, his chest tight with the knowledge that one small moment could undo everything. He had survived so much by keeping the truth folded neatly out of sight, but now Jason was looking at him like the answer was standing right there in front of him, waiting to be named. And Ethan could already feel it. The shape of the question, the weight of the discovery, the terrible, tender instant when Jason would understand exactly what he had almost lost. Jason stood in the hallway for a moment after Ethan disappeared into the bedroom, his face unreadable, his posture careful in a way that seemed almost unnatural for him. The whole house had gone quiet, but it was not the kind of quiet that felt peaceful. It was the kind that came after a truth had been brushed too close to the surface, the kind that made every creak in the floor sound louder than it should. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat as he reached the bedroom doorway, and when he stepped inside, he found the room exactly as he had left it, except now it felt like a place full of warnings. The bed was neatly made, the curtains were half open to the late afternoon light, and on the dresser sat the framed photo he had almost forgotten to turn face down. He moved to it too fast, fingers closing around the frame, but then he stopped, because the memory attached to that picture hit him all at once. 6 years ago, he had stood in a hospital room with exhausted hands and a shaking voice, looking down at a tiny life he had promised to protect no matter what. Back then, he had believed that love could survive bad timing. He had believed that if he was patient enough, the right person would eventually come back and understand. Life had not been kind enough to reward that faith. Instead, it had taught him how to keep quiet, how to smile when people asked too many questions, how to become an expert at carrying grief without letting it show. Behind him, the floorboard gave the faintest sound, and Ethan turned to find Jason in the doorway, not pressing forward, not invading the space, just standing there with a look that made Ethan suddenly feel seen in a way he was not ready for. Jason was still holding himself carefully, but there was a softness in his face now, a deeper attention that seemed to reach past the present and touch something buried underneath it. I remember this room, Jason said quietly. Ethan swallowed. You should not. Jason glanced toward the dresser, toward the photo, toward the small objects that made the room feel lived in, and his voice lowered even more. You have been living here all this time. It was not a question, but Ethan still felt trapped by it. He nodded once, slow and guarded. Jason stepped closer by a single pace, then stopped again, as if he understood that any more would feel like pressure. Why did you leave? He asked. The question landed with such gentle force that Ethan almost laughed from the pain of it. He turned away, pretending to straighten something that did not need straightening, because if he looked at Jason too long, he might say the truth before he had decided he was ready. Because I had to, Ethan said. Jason did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a kind of careful disbelief. And did you ever think I would come back? Ethan closed his eyes for a second, and the answer came to him in a rush of old hurt and old hope. He had thought about it more than once. On the hardest nights, when the house felt too quiet and the world outside seemed to move on without him, he had imagined 100 different returns. He had imagined anger, regret, confusion, even indifference. He had never imagined this version of Jason, standing in his doorway with concern in his eyes and a question hanging between them like a fragile bridge. I stopped expecting things a long time ago, Ethan said at last. That seemed to affect Jason more than any dramatic answer could have. His shoulders shifted, his expression tightened, and something like regret crossed his face. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that demanded attention. The quieter kind. The kind that settled in after years and did not leave. Then maybe you should not have had to, Jason said. Ethan looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time the old ache inside him seemed to flicker against something new. There was distance in Jason's eyes. Yes, and confusion too. But there was also an unmistakable pull, a sense that something inside him was trying to remember its way home. Ethan had spent years building walls around this life, around this child, around the simple, ordinary routines that kept him steady. But now Jason was here, standing in the middle of all that careful order, and the walls no longer felt strong enough to hold. Outside, the evening light softened the room to gold, and for one suspended moment, Ethan could almost believe that the next words out of Jason's mouth might change everything. Yet Jason only looked at him with painful patience, as though he had finally understood that the truth was not something to be forced open, but something that would have to be trusted into the light one piece at a time. Jason did not move for a long moment after Ethan fell quiet. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, the warm evening light resting across the table, the chairs, the small signs of a life that had been carefully built and carefully protected. His gaze drifted from Ethan's face to the child nearby, then back again, as if he were trying to align two truths that refused to fit together. There was no anger in him now, not the kind Ethan had braced for. Instead, there was something quieter and far more unsettling, a tenderness wrapped around confusion so tightly that Jason looked almost unsteady beneath it. Ethan kept his hands folded in his lap, every muscle in his body waiting for the wrong question, the wrong memory, the wrong accusation. But Jason only lowered himself into the chair opposite him and looked at the room with a kind of careful reverence, as though he knew he was standing inside something sacred even if he did not yet know why. "This is a good home," he said at last, his voice low and thoughtful. The words should have been simple, almost casual, but they landed with an ache that Ethan felt all the way through his chest. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The child shifted closer to Ethan's side, curious but unafraid, and Jason's eyes followed the movement with a flicker of attention that looked too natural to be ignored. Something in his face changed then, so briefly Ethan might have imagined it. A softness, a recognition that never fully arrived. Jason leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, and asked, "How long have you lived here?" Ethan answered carefully, giving only what was safe. "Years. Long enough to make the house feel like his own. Long enough for routines to become shelter. Long enough to stop expecting anything to come back from the past." Jason listened without interrupting, but the silence between them had begun to feel charged, as if every ordinary word was brushing against a deeper current beneath the surface. Outside, the light was fading now, turning the window glass into a muted reflection of the two of them seated across from each other. Jason's expression tightened a little, not with suspicion, but with strain, as though some inner thread had been pulled too hard. "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "that I have been somewhere like this before." Ethan's throat went dry. He had spent so many years preparing for this moment in his own mind that hearing it spoken aloud made it feel both inevitable and impossible. He looked down at the table, at the grain of the wood, at the small scar near the edge that had never been fixed, and forced his voice to stay steady. "Memory does strange things," he said. "Sometimes it gives back only pieces." Jason watched him closely, and for a second the air between them seemed to narrow, all the old distance thinning under the weight of something unnamed. Then the child reached out and touched Jason's sleeve with a small, innocent curiosity. Jason went still. His eyes dropped to the child's hand, then lifted to Ethan's face with a shock so subtle it might have been missed by anyone else. It was not full recognition, not yet, but it was enough to make Ethan's pulse skip. Jason looked as though the touch had opened a door somewhere inside him, one that had been locked for years and was now beginning to loosen at the edges. He did not pull away. Instead, he let the child keep hold of his sleeve, and the corner of his mouth shifted with the faintest trace of wonder, as if he were witnessing something he had not known he had been missing. Ethan felt his own guarded heart answer that shift with a dangerous hope. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past had returned, but because Jason was here, and he was listening, and he was not leaving. For the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like a threat. It felt like a question finally brave enough to be asked. The next morning arrived quietly, with pale winter lights slipping across the kitchen floor and settling over the small stack of drawings Ethan had spread out beside a mug of tea that had gone cold hours ago. He had barely slept, not because the night had been restless in any dramatic way, but because every few moments he found himself thinking about Jason's expression when the child had touched his sleeve, that brief opening of something private and vulnerable, like a window crack just enough to let in air. Ethan was still standing at the counter when Jason came in, hair slightly tousled, wearing a dark sweater that made him look even more serious than usual. He paused at the doorway, as if he had not expected to find the room already occupied. Then his gaze moved to the drawings, to the tea, to Ethan, and softened by a degree so slight that Ethan almost wondered if he had imagined it. "You are up early," Jason said. His voice was calm, but there was a carefulness in it now, a new awareness, as though he had begun to understand that speaking to Ethan required more than simple politeness. Ethan gave a small smile and lifted one of the sketches. "I wanted to keep working while the ideas were still fresh." Jason stepped closer, not close enough to crowd him, only near enough that Ethan could catch the faint, clean scent of soap and winter air. It should have been ordinary. Somehow it was not. Jason looked down at the page Ethan held, studying the loose lines and shapes with a focus so intent that Ethan felt seen in a way he had not expected. There was no judgment in that attention, no impatience, only the quiet seriousness of a man learning the shape of a new truth. Behind them, the house remained still. Somewhere farther down the hall, a child laughed at nothing in particular, and the sound made Jason's eyes shift toward the corridor. He did not move immediately, but Ethan saw the change in him, a tenderness pulling at the edges of his restraint. "He has been asking about you," Jason said after a moment. The words came out evenly, but they carried a weight Ethan could feel settle in his chest. "About me?" Jason nodded once. "He wants to know when you will draw again. He says your pictures make the walls feel less lonely." Ethan looked down at the sketch in his hands, suddenly unable to speak for a second. It was such a simple thing, and yet it landed with the force of something he had longed to hear without knowing how badly he needed it. He had spent so many years believing he was only useful when he stayed quiet, only welcome when he took up as little space as possible. Now there was a child in the next room speaking about him, as if his presence changed the air itself. Jason seemed to notice the shift in Ethan's face, because his expression gentled further. "If you would like," he said, "you could draw him something this morning. He would be very proud to show it to the others." Ethan let out a quiet breath, surprised by how much the offer meant. It was not grand. It was not a promise wrapped in ceremony. It was simply an opening, a place where he might belong without having to earn it first. He glanced toward the hall, then back at Jason. "I would like that," he said. Jason's eyes held his for a second longer than before, and in that silence Ethan felt something settle between them. Not a confession, not yet, but a steady and unmistakable willingness to continue. After all the years of running, doubt, and broken promises, that was enough to make the day feel different. Not safe, not finished, but different. And sometimes different was how hope began. "I can do that, but I do not have the approved title in this chat message, and your instructions require me to use the exact locked title. Please resend the exact title you want me to follow, and I will write part 5 in the required format. Please resend the exact approved title in this chat, and I will write part 6 in one continuous English block exactly as requested." By the time the afternoon lights softened against the windows, the house no longer felt like a place built around silence. It felt lived in, warmed by the small, ordinary sounds that had once seemed impossible to imagine there. In the kitchen, the kettle gave a low hum while our youngest sat in a high chair kicking her feet, delighted by the attention she received from everyone within reach. Our older child was at the table with a stack of colored paper and a handful of pencils, determined to make something beautiful with serious concentration. I watched them both for a moment, letting the calm settle into me, because moments like this still felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. Years ago, I had measured every day by what I had lost. Now I measured them by what remained, and by how gently life had returned to me. He came in from the hallway carrying a folded blanket over one arm and a small basket of fresh fruit in the other, already looking toward me before he said a word. That was his habit now, and it never failed to make my chest tighten. He always checked the room first, then the children, then me, as if making sure we were all still safe, still here, still his in the only way that mattered. He crossed the kitchen, set the basket down, and leaned in to brush a quiet kiss against my temple. It was such a simple gesture that no one in the room even paused for it, and yet I felt it everywhere. He had changed slowly, not in dramatic declarations, but in steady, stubborn ways that became impossible to ignore. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered small details. He asked before he decided. He no longer carried his emotions like armor, and when something troubled him, he named it instead of hiding it away. I knew how hard that had been for him. I had seen him sit through long evenings of therapy when he could have hidden behind work, and I had seen the frustration on his face when he failed to be patient with himself. But he kept going. He kept showing up. He kept choosing the hard, honest path, even when it meant admitting all the places where he had once fallen short. That was what made his devotion feel real to me now. Not perfection, not grand gestures, just repetition, care, and the kind of attention that never asked to be rewarded. Later, when the children drifted from the table into the living room, he stood beside me at the counter and rested one hand lightly at my waist, waiting for me to look at him. There was something on his mind, and I could tell because his eyes held that particular softness they always had when he was trying to say something important without crowding me. "Are you tired?" he asked, quietly enough that only I could hear. I smiled because the question itself was part of the healing. Years ago, he would have assumed instead of asking. Now he waited. "A little," I said, honest as always. "But it is a good kind of tired." His expression shifted at that, relief and affection crossing his face in the same breath. He nodded, then reached for my hand and lifted it to his lips with a care that still surprised me sometimes. "Then rest after dinner," he said. "I will handle everything tonight." It was such a small promise, and yet it held the weight of all the years that came before it. After we ate, the children were tucked in with their usual complaints and last-minute requests for water, one more story, one more minute. When at last the house quieted, we stepped out onto the back porch together, where the evening air carried the faint scent of cut grass and rain from somewhere far away. The yard stretched softly under the fading sky, and he stood beside me without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "I still think about the day I almost lost this life before I understood what it was." I turned toward him, searching his face. He looked different when he said things like that, less guarded, more exposed, like he had finally decided that honesty was not a threat. "You did not lose it," I said. "You learned how to keep it." His shoulders eased at that, and he let out a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. Then he took my hand and pressed his forehead to mine. There was no drama in the moment, no need for one. It was enough just to stand there together, with the darkening sky above us and the lights from the house glowing behind us, as if life had gently closed a circle we never thought would end so well. Inside, one of the children laughed at something on the television, and the sound drifted through the open door like proof that the future had become real. I closed my eyes for a second and let myself feel it all, the safety, the warmth, the quiet miracle of being loved in a way that asked for nothing except that I stay. And when I opened my eyes again, he was still there, still looking at me as if I were the answer to a question he had spent years learning how to ask. I did not answer right away, because for a moment I was busy watching the way the evening settled over the house. The last of the daylight had thinned into a soft gray blue, and the windows reflected the warm light inside like the whole place was holding its breath. After everything we had been through, I had learned not to take a quiet night for granted. Quiet had once meant waiting for something to go wrong. Now it meant our son was safe in the next room. Our family was under the same roof, and the man beside me was no longer someone I had to fear losing. He stayed close as we walked back inside, his hand resting at the small of my back in that careful way he had taken to lately, as if he was still afraid that one wrong movement might break the peace between us. But nothing about him felt uncertain now. He had become steady in a way that was almost surprising, the kind of steady that did not announce itself, only proved itself over and over in the smallest details. He remembered the things I liked without asking twice. He carried the heavier grocery bags before I could reach for them. He made a habit of checking the locks before bed, then checking on the children, then checking on me last, like the order mattered because it said where his heart was. When we stepped into the kitchen, I found a bowl on the counter filled with strawberries already washed and cut, and I turned to look at him with a smile that felt too soft to hold inside. "You did this?" I asked, and he gave a slight shrug that would have looked casual on anyone else, but on him it was almost shy. "I remembered you said they were easier to eat this way," he said. That was the kind of man he had become. Not a grand speaker. Not a man trying to impress a room. Just someone who paid attention. Someone who listened long enough to change his habits. I reached for one of the strawberries and let the sweetness settle on my tongue as I looked out the kitchen window. The yard was turning dark, but the porch light had come on, casting a golden circle over the steps where our youngest had once stumbled and laughed himself breathless. That memory came back so clearly that I almost felt the old ache of time passing, but it was no longer painful. It was simply part of the story now, the proof that we had moved forward without losing what mattered. Across the room, our oldest was spread out on the floor with colored pencils, working on a picture with the determined concentration of a child who believed every line was important. I could not see the whole page from where I stood, but I could see the shape of a house, a tree, and two figures drawn side by side. It made something warm open in my chest. "I think he drew us again," I said quietly. He followed my gaze and smiled in that rare, full way that made his whole face soften. "He always does," he replied. There had been a time when I would have expected distance in his voice, or hesitation, or that familiar wall he used to keep between himself and everything that scared him. But he had spent months tearing that wall down, one honest conversation at a time. He had apologized more than once, not with dramatic speeches, but with actions that left no room for doubt. He showed up. He stayed. He learned how to be present in the places he had once avoided. And in return, I learned how to stop bracing for the worst every time happiness arrived. That was the strange gift of healing. It did not come all at once. It came in little, unremarkable moments. In shared dinners. In bedtime stories. In the sound of someone coming home before the house grew cold. In the ease of being able to lean against him without wondering whether he would move away. Later, when the children were finally asleep and the house had gone completely still, we stood together in the hallway for a long time without speaking. The silence between us was not empty. It was full in the most comforting way. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the old house settling, the quiet rhythm of his breathing beside me. Then he reached for my hand again, and this time he lifted it to his lips with a gentleness that made my eyes sting. "You know," he said after a moment, "there was a time when I thought I had already ruined everything that could matter to me." I turned toward him, saying nothing, because I knew better than to rush him when he was speaking from the deepest part of himself. He looked at the dark window at the end of the hall, where our reflections stood faintly together, then back at me. I spent so long believing I did not know how to build anything worth keeping. But now I know better. His thumb brushed once over my knuckles. A life can be repaired. A family can be rebuilt. And if I am lucky, I get to keep learning that for the rest of mine. My throat tightened at the simple truth in his voice. There was no performance in it. No need to prove himself anymore. He had already done that. This was just the rest of our life, spoken plainly, as if it had always been waiting for us to say it out loud. I stepped closer and rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath his shirt. For the first time in a long time, I did not think about what might be taken away. I only thought about what had been given back. The house around us, the children asleep down the hall, the soft light still glowing from the living room, and the man holding me like he had finally learned that love was not something to win, but something to protect. And as the night deepened around us, I understood that this was what peace looked like in our home now. Not perfection, not silence, but the kind of togetherness that could survive anything because it had already survived the hardest part. When the morning light slipped through the curtains, I woke to the quiet kind of happiness I used to think only belonged to other people. The bed was warm beside me, the room still and soft, and for a moment I simply listened to the house breathe around us. Down the hall, one of the children murmured in their sleep, and from somewhere below came the faint clink of dishes as breakfast was being prepared. Nothing in that sound carried urgency anymore. No one was waiting for bad news. No one was bracing for another loss. I turned my head and found him already awake, watching me with that same steady patience he had learned to wear so well. It still amazed me that this man, who once seemed made of distance and silence, now looked at me like I was the safest place he knew. He reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from my forehead, his touch gentle enough to feel like a promise. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, and I smiled before answering, because the truth was so simple it almost made me laugh. I had slept well for the first time in years. Not because life had become perfect, but because it had finally become ours. Later that morning, we wandered into the kitchen together, moving around each other with the easy rhythm of people who no longer had to guess what the other needed. The children came running in after a while, still in their socks, talking over one another about a drawing, a new book, and a game they wanted to play in the yard. He listened to every word as if each one mattered. That was the thing I noticed most now. He did not rush through the small moments anymore. He stayed inside them. He made room for them. He made room for us. After breakfast, we stepped outside and stood on the porch, looking over the quiet stretch of land beyond the house. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of cut grass and the distant sweetness of flowers blooming near the fence. The youngest child ran ahead across the yard, and the older one followed, both of them laughing in that bright, unguarded way that children do when they have never had to learn fear at home. I watched them for a long moment, then looked up at him. There were lines at the corners of his eyes now, signs of time and effort and all the ways he had changed. But to me, those lines were beautiful because they were proof that he had lived through the hard years and still chosen to become someone better. He slipped an arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into him without thinking. No grand speech was needed. We had already lived the kind of story that only becomes meaningful after it survives the worst chapter. So when he asked me quietly whether I was happy, I did not answer with a perfect sentence. I simply took his hand and held it tighter. Because happiness, for us, had become something lived instead of declared. It was in the way the children called for us from the yard. It was in the way the morning sun warmed the steps. It was in the way we could stand side by side without fear of what the world might try to take next. And as I looked at our home, our life, and the man beside me, I understood that this was not the ending of anything. It was the beginning of a peace we had earned with patience, with truth, and with love that refused to let go.